All right, guys, we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome back. Moving on to the next unit now. We just finished up with our discussion of social media and the impacts of social media. And we're going to move forward now into the world of journalism. Slight warning before we get into this content. In case you couldn't tell by now, I am a person with opinions. uh, Especially when it comes to the world of journalism. I've worked as a professional journalist. I've worked as an amateur journalist. I teach journalism. I have a lot of opinions on the subject matter. I have a lot more opinions as of late because journalism is a field that has been kind of attacked, I guess is the nice way of saying it, in a lot of different ways, from a lot of different sources. The idea of journalism and the idea of the career of a journalist has really been degraded by a lot of people for very personal, very selfish reasons. And so I get, I'll admit straight up, I get defensive in talking about journalism and the importance of it. I'm very passionate about the subject and very passionate about the importance of the field of journalism in a civil society, especially in a democracy, or a democratic republic. I'm very, very, very concerned with what role journalism is playing, what role journalism should be playing. And we're going to talk about a lot of why, right? Not just why I believe that, but why do a lot of people believe that? Why should journalism be taken seriously? And why should journalism be performed seriously by serious people? So let's go ahead and do that. First and foremost, we have to look at what the role of journalism is in a free society. And this is something that we talked about, but this was 7 weeks ago. What is the role of journalism? Well, one is to offer surveillance. And again, as I mentioned several weeks ago, not surveillance in a creepy way, but rather the idea of surveillance in journalism is that they're there to let you know what's going on around the world, right? To provide you the images and the explanations of things that are going on in places where you can't be. I'm currently sitting in Rockford, Illinois. You're currently sitting in, Freeport or Stockton or wherever else in Illinois. You have no idea what is happening outside of my door right now. And I have no idea what is happening outside of your door right now. But journalism allows me to get that information. If something happens in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, that's of importance, I'll find out about it because of the surveillance function of journalism. To let us know when things have occurred, what occurred, where it occurred, when it occurred, how it occurred. Because again, people can't be everywhere. An individual can't be everywhere. So there are things that are happening in places where you can't be that are important to you. And you have a right to know about it. You deserve to know about it. You should know about it. And that is the primary role of journalism, is to let you know what is going on in those places where you are not. The next role of journalism is correlation. And again, what we touched on before, the idea that, an important function of journalism, an important role that journalists play is connecting the dots, is explaining how, news that came out of Addis Ababa, Ethiopia this morning is relevant or related, or how it affects something that happened in Seattle, Washington 2 weeks ago, right? Journalists help us figure out how those pieces of the world go together. They help us correlate one event with another, one issue with another. Not that we can't do that on our own, much like surveillance. We could, right? If I was standing in downtown Rockford and I saw something going on, I don't need the news to tell me what happened. I was there. I can make connections on my own as well. But everyone has limitations. Everyone has frames of reference that are limited. And so journalism does a really great service to a society by saying, hey, you may not have realized how these things are connected, so I'm going to explain to you how they're connected so we can get a clearer picture of our world and better understand the world around us. Not necessarily in a manipulative way, not in a control way, but rather in a, just the way that a teacher would, say, like, hey, this happened in this year and this also happened in this year. Here's why you may not have thought of those two things as being connected, but they are. Journalism teaches us about our world. It shows us our world, and it teaches us about our world. The third role is cultural transmission. Journalism helps to transmit culture both to successive generations as well as to other people around the world. It's a unfortunate reality that most Americans never consume foreign press. Most Americans will never look at a newspaper or a news channel from another country, but you should. You absolutely should. If for no other reason than to understand your own newspapers better, your own American news system better. News is reported differently in Canada than it is in the US. It's reported differently in Australia than it is in the US. Because the way you approach a story, the way you explain a story, is a reflection of the culture that you're in. And so journalism not only helps us to understand other cultures by how they focus on a story and what they choose to focus on, but it also helps us to teach future generations about our culture, right? When in very simplistic ways, even, think about any news story you've ever seen or heard or watched about a murder. It's very simplistically, very basically implying murder bad, right? Because we're portraying this cultural belief, we're transmitting this cultural belief that person A murdered person B and person A was wrong for doing so, right? We talk about the victims' families, and we talk about how, this is going to affect the community. And, that's in a very basic way an aspect of cultural transmission. This is why it's so important when we see extremely biased reporting. This is why it's so important to address it, right? And to come at it directly. I used the example before in class of the difference between how the news media portrayed Chris Watts, the white man in Colorado who murdered his wife and children, versus how the media portrayed the black man in Georgia who killed a guy who was trying to rape his daughter. They show a picture of Chris Watts and it's his family photo. They show a picture of the black man defending his daughter and it's his mugshot. That is significant because that is a reflection of the culture that produces that story. So it says something about us that's what we're shown, because that's what we tend to perpetuate as well. You'll hear people complain about the media perpetuating violence, or the media is perpetuating this hoax, or they're doing this or that. That's an implicit acknowledgement that the way you frame a story affects the people who read it. So if you have ever complained about the way the media presents any issue, then you absolutely implicitly have to understand that matters. And that's why people get so upset with how the media portrays one demographic versus another. It's a perpetuation, it's a transmission of a cultural belief that isn't doing anybody any favors, right? It is creating more harm than good. Okay. So the role of journalism here, again, we repeated myself here, but it's something we've already talked about, but it's worth, being very direct and bringing it back. Journalism is there to tell us what's going on, to explain to us what's going on, and also to help us understand ourselves, right? It's to help us transmit those beliefs and those values that we as a society hold on to. In a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about actual, real sociological research that's been done when it relates to media and its effects on society. And there's a wonderful study we're going to talk about that looks at what are the actual values that journalism in America tends to put forward. What are the values that journalists in America report on as positive? In other words, what exactly is the culture that journalism in America transmits and reinforces. And the elements of that study are probably going to surprise you. They are not what you tend to hear people say is the agenda of the media. So I always look forward to that conversation because it's very eye-opening for a lot of people in a lot of ways. So how do we gather news? And again, a little bit of redundancy here. This is something I've touched on before, but let's get more specific about it. Let's get more detailed about it. How does news get gathered, right? What does a journalist actually do? How's a journalist do their job, as it were, right? Well, one way you can gather news is through what's called wire stories, right? So you have these wire services all throughout the world that all they do is they write up stories and put them out on a wire service, which is essentially like a subscription bulletin board service or a subscription email service. And these stories are about what's going on all over the world, right? So whenever you see like the AP, the Associated Press, or Reuters, or Knight Ridder, these are all wire services. So a reporter for AP, for example, right? You might work for the AP but live in South Sudan, and your job is simply to write up the who, the what, the when, and the where of everything that happens in South Sudan that day that's newsworthy, right? That is why a newspaper like the Journal Standard can have coverage of stories in the South Sudan, or of stories in Queensland, Australia, or stories in Beijing. The Journal Standard isn't sending anybody to Beijing, right? They're simply subscribed to an AP service that already has somebody there, right? So one way we gather news is simply by subscribing to news services where they do the work for you. By subscribing to that service, you're allowed to then use their stories as you see fit. You can put as many of their stories in your newspaper as you want. They're doing all the journalism. All you have to do is kind of rerun it, right? Another way that we gather news is through what are called pseudo events. Pseudo events are events that are put on basically for the purpose of generating news content. For example, every year Highland does our honors commencement ceremony, right? Or honors convocation, right? Where students who have a GPA of a certain level or above are given this distinguished ceremony separate from regular commencement. Before we do that every year, we send a press release to all local media, right? We send a press release to the TV stations, to the radio stations, to the newspapers to say, hey, we're doing this thing. You might want to send a reporter and a cameraman out here so that, you can cover this because it's a really important story that people in our community need to know about. You should help get that word out. Well, that's a pseudo event, right? It's marketing, right? Pseudo events are essentially marketing. It's where I can convince the news media to cover this story as if it's of public importance, when really all it does is it gets my organization or my issue on the news, right? It gives my organization or my issue publicity that I don't have to pay for. And this happens a lot. I mentioned this before when I worked at the Rockford Register-Star in their newsroom. I was just completely inundated with emails and faxes. That's how old I am. I used to get faxes from different events in the community, different people in the community about like, oh, this is happening today. This is happening today. And while I'm sure your luncheon to celebrate the 38th member of the Polish American Auxiliary Committee's Hall of Fame is really important to you, it might not be that important to the readers of the Rockford Register-Star. So that those pseudo events are there to try and generate press. And oftentimes, unfortunately, a newspaper or a radio station or a television station will end up covering those pseudo events to fill time. It's easy for them, right? If I have column inches to fill, right? If I know, there's just not a lot going on, not a lot of scheduled things going on for today, I can easily pull out my stack of press releases and go, okay, maybe we'll cover this story today. right? So sometimes news is gathered simply because we're notified of it in advance, and we need to fill space. We need to fill time. And so we cover these pseudo events. They're not real events. They're not significant, really. It's just kind of a nice fluff to fill space and to fill time. This goes hand in hand with another concept in the news called a soft news day, or otherwise called a slow news day. A soft news day is where there's just not a lot of really important, significant things happening in that day. And you'll get those, right? You'll get those days. Not on a global scale, right? You know, the New York Times doesn't have a soft news day, right? There's always something, there are always several significant things going on around the world. But if the focus of my newspaper or my news channel is local, there's just not always something happening around here. You know, when we run the journalism class, which by the way, you guys should all sign up for, it's really fun and it's free and it's awesome. When we run the journalism class, the Mcom 131, news practicum, or journalism practicum, excuse me, we produce a weekly 30-minute newscast that is focused on campus and local issues. You'd be amazed how often we are scrambling to try and get a full 30 minutes because this place is boring. There's just not a lot going on, right? Highland is a small campus. It's not a very engaged community. The demographic area around us, the geographic area around us, excuse me, is not very active. We don't do a lot of events. And now in the time of Corona, Jesus, there's really nothing going on. In producing Highland News Now, which is the news show that we produce, we have a lot of soft news days. We have soft news weeks. There's just not much going on. And so in those instances, we're always looking for something to fill the time with. And that's when those pseudo events become much more important. That's when you get a lot of coverage of those pseudo events, you know, like, oh, the global task force is hosting this event and they're looking at this and this, and this club is doing this, and nobody really gives a shit. Nobody really cares. It's not that I think that the world needs to know what Student Senate is doing. It's that I need to fill my time. And so those soft news days they suck for a journalist, but they're such a windfall for community members, right? Who are looking for publicity, who are looking for a way to get their word out. Another aspect of news gathering that, again, we have touched on is the idea of agenda setting or gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is the concept we've discussed several times so far this semester. The idea that, you know, I as a journalist get to kind of guard the gate of what information is out there versus what information I'm going to amplify, what information I'm going to put a megaphone behind and spread even farther, right? I'm keeping that gate of information. And hand in hand with that, slightly different, but also very much connected, is the idea of agenda setting. Not only do I get to determine what stories are important enough to amplify and what stories are not, but I also get to determine how those stories are covered. And I get to determine what side of those issues are covered and at what depth, right? I get to set the agenda for my community. You know, there's always people on social media who will post things like, oh, the media's not covering this story. We need to blow this up because the media's not covering it. And they usually say that because there's some kind of conspiracy mind behind it of like, you know, like, oh, they don't want you to know. No, it's just, we don't care most of the time, right? Sometimes, yeah. Sometimes it is like, yeah, we don't think people should know that. Sometimes it's a matter of like, yeah, it's not. It will create more panic to let this out. But more often than not, it's just that people just don't care, right? You know, the new big one that I see all the time, every time I get on social media now, there's somebody posting something about Save Our Children, right? And, you know, like, oh, there's all this child trafficking and why isn't the media covering this? A, they are. They are and they have. Do a Google News search for child trafficking. You will be flooded with results, right? The news media has always covered child trafficking, always. Why are they not covering it as much as you want? Because it's not happening in the way that you're concerned with. Child trafficking isn't the result of some cabal of Hollywood and government elites who are raping children in the basement of a pizza parlor. That's not happening. What's actually happening is that family members are prostituting their children. Friends of the family are kidnapping children. The reason that the media, the news media, the legitimate news media doesn't write stories every day about the Illuminati is because the Illuminati isn't fucking real. Grow up. It's not real. They're not drinking adrenochrome. They are not murdering children in satanic rituals. That's why it's not happening. Right? And that's not elitist or snobby. That's just fucking reality. It just it doesn't exist. It isn't occurring. Right? Sometimes the news sets an agenda of sanity. Sometimes the news sets an agenda of rationality. It's not always a conspiracy. Agenda setting is often simply, look, the real story isn't as interesting. The real story isn't as entertaining or as thrilling or as an action movie. The real story is boring. And you people don't buy newspapers when the story is boring. So we're not going to write about the boring stories. The reality is the most significant determining factor in whether or not a story gets covered or doesn't get covered is whether or not it will sell. Whether we're talking television, internet, radio, or print. If covering that story isn't going to sell copies, isn't going to keep eyeballs on the screen, isn't going to get click-through rate, why am I going to put the energy into it? Journalists aren't nonprofit entities, right? Journalists exist in a business world. Whether or not they should is a question we'll address, but they do. That is the current state of affairs. They do. And they're not hiding stories because they're part of the lizard people. They're not hiding anything. They're making choices based upon reason and based upon profitability. And, well, if you don't like it, too damn bad. It's kind of your fault. We're talking about that a little bit here, but it's your fault they're like this. So stop it. So what are some of the types of journalism we can see in our everyday society? What types of journalism do we deal with? One is a group of people called stringer reporters. And stringers are your straight news people, right? They're the ones they're just there to write the who, the what, the when, the where stories, right? They're just doing the straight news. This is what happened today in Rockford, right? It's much more science than art being a stringer. Your job is to take in information, to interview people, and record what they say and put it into a format that's easily readable and easily understood. And that's it, right? That's what a stringer does. This is a majority of what news reporting is these days. It's just straight up who, what, where, when. Maybe sometimes how, but not always, and very rarely why. It's almost always just who, what, where, when. What happened? Where did it happen? Who did it? When did it happen? That's it. This is what a lot of people think all journalism should be, and they're dead wrong. They're completely fucking wrong. Journalism can't be pure surveillance function. It can't be. And we're going to talk about why. But anyway. Another type of journalism is called interpretive reporting. Back in the good old days, in ye olden times, newspapers and news stations had what were called beat reporters, B-E-A-T, beat, where that reporter was assigned a beat, meaning a subject area that they were kind of the local expert in. So at one time, the Journal Standard had an education beat reporter. And that individual's job was to cover anything that was going on in the world of education in their district, in their geographic area. So they would go to school board meetings. They would interview the superintendents and the principals. They would pay attention to any hirings and firings that were going on in local schools. And that was all they did, right? Their job was just to be an expert on that subject matter. They didn't, your beat reporter for education didn't also go downtown and cover crime. You had a crime reporter who that's all they did was cover crime. The advantage of interpretive reporting is that it creates experts in the subject who can contextualize information better. If I'm an education reporter, what happens today, I can contextualize easily with what happened 2 years ago because I also covered that. I was also there for that, right? Because I'm an expert in the field. This is all I do. All I do is talk to people in the field and write stories about the field and study the field. If I'm a crime reporter, I have a relationship with law enforcement in the area. I have a relationship with the legal community in my area. I know the laws in my area. I'm an expert on crime. And as such, I can write more thorough, more complete, more nuanced stories that are going on in my community, in my field. The downside of interpretive reporting is it's expensive. Think about how many individual reporters you would need if each one of them was a specialist. You need a crime reporter, an education reporter, multiple sports reporters, right? Because there's always a lot going on in sports. An entertainment reporter. You need a legislative reporter. You need up and up and up we go. Right? So that all these different specializations require new payroll, require more staff. And that gets expensive to operate. So instead today we have just general reporters. We have just MMJs, multimedia journalists, who, you're writing stories about crime and you're writing stories about film and you're writing stories about, the county board and you're writing stories about the community college board and you're not a specialist in anything. You're a jack of all trades and a master of none. I long for the days of interpretive reporting because those were people you could like the whole community knew that was your guy, right? That was your person who understood the issue. I remember when I worked at the Register-Star, we had a reporter there in the sports department named Phil Pash. Phil's actually an Akron alumni, coincidentally enough. But Phil Pash was our automotive sports guy. If you wanted to know anything, and I mean anything, about any automotive sport, Phil knew it. Because that's what he had done his entire career. Right? His entire career, he had covered NASCAR and drag racing and truck series and all that, from the local to the national level. And so he knew all of it. He was a walking history book. He was a walking encyclopedia of all of those things. Phil's opinion on politics didn't mean jack shit. Phil didn't know anything about, who was on the county board, but he knew everything there was to know about automotive sports, right? And everyone in the community knew it. If you needed to know something about that subject, you went to Phil. The days of the beat reporter are behind us, and that's a real shame. It's a real shame not only for the field, but again, for the community at large, because it's a resource we don't have anymore. That's a resource we can't go to, which sucks, right? It makes it harder for us to get good answers because now we just have to go to Google. Well, fuck. I don't know who these people are. I don't know what answer I'm getting and whether or not it's reasonable or who's providing it. So interpretive reporting is again, it's something I miss dearly. It's very, very dearly. And then there's investigative reporting, which is, again, something I've mentioned before. And we talked about Harper's Magazine and how it kind of launched the idea of investigative journalism in the United States. The idea that the story isn't always on the surface. People in power tend to have things they don't want everyone else to know. And the role of investigative journalism is to find out what those things are, right? What is the whole story? It's not just, oh, okay, well, the college says that enrollment is down because of COVID. But if I look deeper, I can see, well, actually, there's a significant number of students who are not coming back to Highland. There's a significant number of students who are choosing to go elsewhere because of these factors, right? Do I accept the explanation of the people involved? Or do I find my own conclusions? And again, as I mentioned before, we talked about investigative journalism. The problem with investigative journalism is that it's expensive. It costs a lot of money to do it well. It's difficult. It's expensive. You don't make a lot of friends. But yet at the same time, we all intrinsically understand the importance of that idea. If you've ever been around children, you get this. When something in my house breaks and I ask my children what happened, I'm not going to accept what they say at face value, because why would I? If I did that, then none of them would have ever done anything. My children are the most innocent human beings on earth. No, I have to investigate it myself. I have to look beyond that surface explanation, because the truth is never just that simple. Especially when we're dealing with larger issues, right? Again, I mentioned before the movie Spotlight, which you should all absolutely watch, about the Catholic abuse scandal in Boston, right? Or there have been several instances of great investigative journalism that uncovered or exposed, cancer-causing pollution, where companies had said, no, what we're doing is perfectly fine. It's not harming everybody. It's not harming anybody. It's completely safe. And after investigative reporting by journalists, not by government, by journalists, after the journalists get in there and look at it and investigate and track down leads and speak with specialists, after investigative journalism, we discover, oh, wait, you've caused thousands of people to die because of your negligence. If you're a stringer reporter, you go, oh, well, they said it's fine, so okay. You can't. You got to be skeptical. You have to be skeptical, because it's just human nature to not give away things that are going to harm you. Self-preservation is human nature. And investigative reporting says the good of the Commonwealth, the good of the people, cannot be dependent on somebody's self-preservation breaking. Right? It can't be dependent on somebody's sense of self-preservation wavering. We have to get to the bottom of it ourselves. Another type of journalism that exists is called public journalism. Public journalism is kind of a egalitarian journalism, I guess would be the way to put it. The idea here is that journalism needs to have standards, but they don't necessarily need to be specialists. School newspapers are a great example of public journalism, right? There are standards that you apply to that news, but you're not required to be degreed, right? You're not required to be a professional. It's, we get, if you know what you're doing and you're capable of following these standards, then all right, that's journalism. Journalism is determined by the product, not by the person. There are several, more than you probably would ever imagine, several small newspapers in our area. Tiny, tiny little weekly newspapers for the most part that you'll never see in your life. You'll never come across these things. Yet they still exist, and they are entirely staffed by non-journalists, right? There's the Warren Flash, right? The Northwest Illinois Farmer, right? These are small community newspapers that are being produced and being written by non-journalists. They're just people from the community who are saying, oh, okay, well, people in our community should know more about this thing, or let's get something out there about this and about that. So the idea of public journalism is that the community, the public, can be its own journalists. It's a nice idea, right? It's a very nice idea. I think it speaks to that kind of egalitarian ideal that most of us have, but obviously has some problems as well. I am not a farmer. As a result, it would be foolish of me to assume that I could understand all the nuanced ethics and responsibilities of farming. I'm not a plumber. I'm not going to understand all the nuance involved with plumbing. And yes, there is actual nuance involved with plumbing. Why then do we assume that journalism doesn't meet that same standard? That you can be a journalist without understanding all the nuance to it, without understanding the ethical dilemmas to it, without understanding the responsibilities of it. One of the great frustrations as a teacher is the number of people who think that they know how to do my job just because they've been in a classroom, right? What I always say is, just because you've been to the cafeteria a bunch of times doesn't mean you know how to cook. Right? I've been to the doctor many times in my life, but I'm not going to perform surgery on anybody. Being on the receiving end of journalism doesn't make you understand journalism. Just as being on the receiving end of a root canal doesn't make you a dentist. So public journalism, it's sweet, but come on. Let's be honest with ourselves. And then there's the worst of the worst. Citizen journalists. These people are scum. I hate them all. I hate all of them. They're the worst people on earth. In case you couldn't tell, that was a personal opinion. Don't write that down. Citizen journalists there is no organization. There is no ethical code. There is no standards. It's like, no, this is me. I'm just me. Citizen journalists are the people with the Facebook pages, right? Rockford Scanner, Freeport Scanner, Today in the Port. These are all citizen journalists, right? They are answerable to no one. They are only held accountable by their readership or their viewership. And that is a horrifically irresponsible way to approach something as important as journalism. Because you will always find idiots who will support you, no matter what you're doing. For fuck's sake, there are flat earthers in the world. There are people on this planet who think it's shaped like a saucer. There are always going to be stupid people to back you up. That's why we don't use public opinion as the measuring stick for truth or for ethics. Because stupid people exist. And citizen journalists are only held accountable by stupid people. They have no principle. They have no ethical code. They have no understanding of the actual craft of journalism. For fuck's sake, they can't even spell most of the time. But they want me to give them the same level of credibility as somebody who's been reporting the news for 20 years after studying it in college for 6? No. I'm sorry, no. That's absurd. That's absolutely absurd. For the same reason, I'm not going to take my car to a YouTube-trained mechanic. You can look up just about anything you want to do to your car on YouTube, but that does not make you the same level as somebody who's a trained mechanic, who's been doing it for 25 years. I'll trust that guy over YouTube any day of the damn week. But when it comes to journalism, oh, well, I like what he has to say. That doesn't mean it's right. Doesn't mean it's good. A lot of people like heroin too, right? It doesn't mean it's good for you. Just because you like what a citizen journalist is doing doesn't mean that they're doing it the right way. It just means that they're confirming your biases. It means they're giving you a product you enjoy, not that you need. You fucking child. Not you. I'm not talking like, not you people specifically, just like in the royal you, right? The general you, the second person you. They piss me off. They should piss you off too, damn it. Whether you ever work in a journalistic field or not, they should bother you because you're an American, right? You're all American? Lindsay, you're an American, right?
I mean, last time I checked, yeah.
You could be Canadian. I don't know. I don't want to assume. If you're an American, you should give a shit. It should bother you. Citizen journalists should bother you because they are influencing your fellow citizens to do stupid shit that harms you. And that should bother you. If it doesn't bother you, I don't know how to help you anymore. You're monsters. Terrible, terrible people. You should stop it. You should stop being terrible people.
I have words.
What's up?
I looked into what we were talking about, like at the beginning of class, with I think that Freeport person, and
Oh,
like
in the port?
yeah, how he like explicitly, outed a death,
Yep.
and like that hit really hard.
Yep. Yep. He's a monster. He's a monstrous human being. And like, and again, it drives me fucking insane that there are people who still follow him, who still support him, not only because of that instance, but because every single day he does something else that completely obliterates the line between ethical journalism and profiteering. Like every day. I mean, for fuck's sake, for a while there, he was putting ads on stories. So, for example, he would like, there's a story of a fight at a middle school, right? There was a fight at one of the middle schools, and he wrote a story about it. And he would, it's Facebook, so it's formatted in this way. He wrote the headline, like, oh, fight breaks out at middle school, several people injured, blah, blah, blah. And then right underneath that was in like a written advertisement for Right Way Furniture. This story brought to you by Right Way Furniture. Right Way Furniture since 1927. What the fuck, man? Like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, you're literally using people's interest in a story about a middle school fight to sell furniture? How is that? How do you sleep, dude? How do you sleep as a human being? And that's ethics 101. That is something that in your very first class you ever take in journalism school, they're going to tell you create an unbreakable barrier between sales and content. You do not ever muddy those waters. But no, I can do it because I'm Greg Chambers and I'm a dick. Again, it also says something very bad about the culture that is being transmitted there. This kind of behavior is acceptable, and who's he accountable to? Right? That shit would never fly at a legitimate newspaper or a legitimate news site. He would have been fired for even having the thought of doing that. But because he is only accountable to his supporters, who clearly don't have that same ethical concern of basic humanity, he just continues. And it's just, it should piss you off. It should piss you off. If it doesn't piss you off, you're not thinking about it hard enough. Go to Today in the Port on Facebook and just he blocked me, so I can't do this. But like, you should go on Today on the Port on Facebook and just go to every story and say you should stop. You need to stop, and you need to stop now. You're hurting the country. Adam is asking, do I think there's a perfect or optimal news outlet? No, there is not a perfect one for sure, because they're run by people and people suck. Is there an optimal? Yes. I think there are levels of good journalism out there, and I think the top level of journalism right now is the BBC and PBS. I think those two organizations, those two entities are doing it right. What those two entities have in common, you might know or might be aware of, is that both of them are publicly owned, right? The BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, is owned by the Crown. They're not dependent on advertisers. So they can report straight, right? They can report straight. Even when it comes to issues of the British Crown, they can report straight. Because while they are sanctioned by the British monarchy, they're not controlled by the British monarchy. Similar to PBS. PBS is sanctioned by the American government, but they are not controlled by the American government. They are allowed to publish what they need to publish without having to bend their will or muddy the waters of their reporting based upon what's going to cause financial concern. Again, like I was saying, when I worked at the Register Star, when I worked at WREX, we have to ask ourselves, is this story going to get people to read us, or is it going to get people to watch us, or is it going to get people to click on the story? That is not a conversation that happens at PBS or BBC. They don't have to factor that in at all. They are incredibly rigorous in their hiring practices, incredibly rigorous in their hiring practices. They have an absolutely stellar record of ethical conduct in their newsrooms, right? They do not play any of those games. They do not play any of those little BS charades of, like, oh, well, I kind of have a conflict of interest, but nobody's going to know about. No. You are hired based on your abilities, and you are maintained based on your integrity. And they're the only ones who are doing that right now. Probably the most controversial opinion I have is that all media should be publicly owned. I think you should de-profit all media, like all of it, including Fox and CNN. I have a lot of thoughts on Fox and CNN. I think Fox and CNN are like any other news operation in the country. They shouldn't exist as a for-profit venture. I think all news media should be nonprofit entities. Publicly owned nonprofit entities. Which, again, probably my most controversial opinion. But I will absolutely defend it. I'll absolutely back it up. And I will talk for hours and hours and hours about why I'm right, you're wrong. Because I'm a godless commie heathen, I guess. I don't know. I never felt like a godless commie heathen, but apparently that's what I am, I've been told. So. All right. Well, it is... wouldn't that limit the number of news? Goddamn right it would number the limit of news channels. That's a feature, not a bug, Adam. That is the point, to limit the number of news channels. Hell yeah. The fewer, the better. I don't want 700 news outlets. No good comes from 700 news outlets, because every one of those news outlets is trying to find a corner of the market that they can claim, which means they're not concerned with the truth and nothing but the truth. If there's only a couple of news channels, right? You would absolutely have different insights in the situations. You would have very different, because human beings have different insights because they have different experiences. What you wouldn't have is echo chambers, right? What you wouldn't have is echo chambers. Breitbart News and Daily Kos, they don't provide unique insights into situations. They provide wishful thinking to people who already agree with them. That's what they provide, not insight. They don't give you depth. They don't explain a subject matter in a new way. They take a situation, explain it in a way that their readership already agrees with, and then they go to another extreme with it to keep you coming back for more. So no, I don't think limiting the number of news channels would limit the number of insights into situations. I think let me rephrase. It would limit the number of insights, but it would not limit the number of rational insights. Facts are facts. I don't care who's reporting it. Facts are facts. You don't need 700 news stations to tell me, where the Dow Jones ended today. The only thing you get out of having 700 news stations is 700 explanations as to why Dow Jones ended the way it did today. And 693 of those insights are full of shit. They're nothing but motivated reasoning. Are there multiple reasons why we could interpret the Dow Jones to end a certain way? Of course there are, but there aren't 700 ways. There aren't 100 ways. There aren't even 50 ways. You can't get much past 6 different opinions before you start talking about the yarn and the push pins in the wall. And again, this is one of the things we're going to talk about here, but I am not a believer that everybody's opinion is valid. Go figure. I know. I don't think the role of journalism is to give every opinion, because there are such a thing as wrong opinions. You believe the earth is flat, you're fucking wrong. And I don't owe you airtime. You believe that vaccines cause autism, you're wrong. And I don't own you any column inches. It's just that simple. And we've gotten to this place where we feel like, oh, no, we got to give all opinions. We got to go all matters equal time. No, we fucking don't. No, we don't. That's absurd. You wouldn't do that in your personal life. Why the hell would you expect that to happen in a newsroom? You don't listen to somebody who spouts insanity and go, oh, well, I owe it to them to hear out their insanity. No, it's fucking insanity. All right. See, now Adam made me go over time. Usually he's the one launching the clock. Now he made me go over. So it's Adam's fault, everybody. Okay. On